Wes from New Frame here. How long does it take for tissues to heal? Is my pain I'm feeling coming from something that hasn't healed properly? Well, today we're going to go over those questions and more in this week's video. First, we're going to start off with some good news. Healing is super predictable. So predictable to the point where it happens in defined steps. Now, there are some people that are maybe a little bit slower healers and some that might be a little bit quicker on average. But what we're able to do is accurately and predictably estimate what part of the healing cycle we're on based on the time of the injury. This is one of the amazing things about the human body. We heal in the background despite if we feel pain or not. It's one thing we can be thankful for, especially since this happens without even having to think about it. We actually follow a predictable timeline for healing to take place. Now, this will slightly depend on the injury. For example, a paper cut is going to take a bit shorter to heal than, say, maybe a broken bone. But based on the type and the severity of the injury, we can give some pretty helpful guidelines. For example, if we take the example of a broken bone, it will generally take 4 to 6 weeks for that bone to recover, as long as it's being immobilized. If that area keeps on moving, it actually disrupts the blood supply, and then it has a hard time laying down the nutrients to heal the bone. That may not sound like that long on the surface, and it isn't compared to other injuries, because our bones have a really strong blood and nerve supply. It takes them overall less time to heal. If we were to take some part of our bodies with a little bit less blood and nerve supply, say like the meniscus in our knees, it will take a lot longer period of time to heal. As we alluded to before, healing takes place in a few defined steps. 4 to be exact. And in this next section, we're going to go over those steps using an example of receiving a partially torn muscle. Now, I hope you're never in this unfortunate circumstance, but let's say you and a friend are canoeing down a river on a beautiful summer morning. The next thing you know, you hear an audible pop in your shoulder. And since the river is relatively calm and you aren't in any immediate threat to your life, you start feeling a searing pain on the top of that shoulder. Well, you and your friend make your way over to the bank of the river and relax, hoping that the pain subsides. A few minutes later, after the incident, you start to notice a small bruise forming on your shoulder and decide, we should call it quits for the day. And this is a great place to segue over to our first phase, the bleeding phase. At home, you continue to notice the bruise getting slightly bigger and bigger over the next few hours, until it finally levels off. When we start to notice bruising and redness on the skin immediately after an injury, we call this part of the bleeding phase. Overall, this is generally the shortest stage and is a passive result of the injury itself. You can almost think of it like a stage when you cut your finger. You start to bleed not because the body is trying to heal anything, but rather because the cut has disrupted the blood in your skin. The time this stage takes is largely impacted by the amount of blood flow to the injured tissue. Lots of blood flow is going to equal lots of bleeding, and a little blood flow is going to equal just a little bit of bleeding. So let's go back to our example. The next day, you wake up and notice that you have some increased swelling in your shoulder, and now it hurts a bit more to move. You feel pressure in your shoulder, and overall, it does not feel great. You still have some bruising, but overall, it's died down since the day before. This lasts for the next couple of weeks, but overall the swelling is lessened a little bit day by day. Now, we call this part the inflammation phase. In this phase, there are a whole bunch of cellular processes that you almost need a PhD to fully understand. So I'm going to break things down to the highlights here. One of the main goals behind the inflammation phase is to actually stop the bleeding phase from happening. So it utilizes a process called vasoconstriction. Vasoconstriction is just another way of saying that the blood vessels in the area tighten up so less blood can get through overall. Then the body uses a component in your blood called platelets to help close up those broken blood vessels and allow for more further healing. Many might be thinking, but Wes, I thought inflammation was just another word for swelling. And it is. The next step is actually the swelling phase in the inflammation phase itself. Now that there isn't any unwanted blood making its way into the tissue, the body actually shunts blood to the area from uninjured blood vessels. And this blood carries more platelets, which further help with clotting, white blood cells, which help fight off foreign invaders and clean out the damage, and finally, ATP, which is our body's use of energy, and it helps all the cells just do their job a little bit better. The inflammation phase can last for as long as a couple days to as long as a few months depending on the injury. And the good news is the inflammation doesn't have to be complete before the next step can hop in and start doing its job. Which leads us to our third phase, the proliferation phase. The proliferation phase, most times than not, begins during the inflammation phase, usually around 48 hours after injury. During this phase, the main goal is to lay down scar tissue to help heal the area as much as possible. The star of this show are what we call fibroblasts. What they do is they produce the building blocks of connective tissue, which end up becoming scar tissue. On one special note about fibroblasts, as they lay down tissues, they don't do it in a super organized way. They go for quantity and not necessarily quality. Not to say they don't do their job well, because they absolutely do. They're just more worried about filling up the hole rather than making it look pretty. What they do is they lay down tissues in a kind of crisscross fashion, kind of like this. And this becomes important for the next and final phase. And before we leave the proliferation phase, there's one more important component I want to talk about. In this phase, there's a process called angiogenesis, which is a big word for simply making more blood supply to the injured area. We're talking more veins, more arteries, more little blood vessels. And if there's anything you gained from this chat so far, is that our blood holds a lot of those elements we need to heal. So growing more vasculature to that area is super important. All right, let's hop on to our final phase of the healing, the fourth phase, which is what we like to call the remodeling phase. And before we do that, let's check back into our canoeing enthusiast. All right, it's only been a couple of weeks, and their shoulder is starting to feel a little bit better, but it's not quite there yet. The shoulder feels a little bit stiff, and it slightly hurts to move, but overall has gone through quite a bit of improvement since the injury. They're able to do some light rowing on the lake, and after a few more weeks, heads back on the river. The last stage is what we like to call the remodeling phase. And to understand this phase, we need to take a look back at the proliferation phase. During this phase, do you remember I mentioned that those fibroblasts work by laying all the scar tissue down in a sort of crisscross-like manner. I did this weird thing with my hand. And are more focused on creating the quantity over the quality. In the remodeling phase, the main goal is to turn that quantity into quality. Over time and with the right stresses, the tissues begin to turn into a more functional unit. This newly laid tissue starts to look like it used to before the injury, and life heads back to normal. Isn't the body just amazing? Now, there are a few times when this whole process doesn't go quite as planned. When you have an infection around that injury, it greatly disrupts the healing cycle. Your body is then unable to fully heal the tissues around the site, and you kind of get stuck in that inflammation phase. And this is why the area usually stays red and inflamed when infection is present. Another instance when the healing cycle doesn't fully get a chance to go according to plan is when you have some sort of connective tissue disorder. Usually I like to think of like an Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, which may disrupt the healing cycle depending on what type of connective tissue that's being affected. Usually it doesn't mean you won't heal, but it might take a little bit longer. Some people out there may be thinking to themselves, but Wes, I still have pain. Does that mean I'm not healing? And I'm going to go ahead and say no. Chronic pain in general doesn't mean that you're not a good healer, because this brings us back to the original point of the whole video. That is, because you have pain, it doesn't mean you're not healing, and it doesn't mean that you have an injury per se. More than anything, chronic pain affects our nervous system. What happens is the nervous system gets ramped up, which causes things that wouldn't normally hurt to start hurting. And this can happen with an injury of previous nature or out of the blue. And when this happens, we do a lot less because we hurt more. And then we kind of get stuck in this cycle of pain. And there's a lot that plays into this. And everyone has a different background, set of illnesses, and a completely different story. And to learn more about this cycle and how it may be impacting your pain, be sure to check out the website www.newframeyourpain.com or leave a comment below and we'd be happy to answer any and all questions. Also, if you haven't yet, get checked by your physician. NewFrame is made to be a supplementary program and not a replacement for any of your current care. But that's all for now. Until next time, take care.